Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is really wonderful to be here. As many of you know, I was scheduled to be here last year, but I was stuck in Dubai trying to get to New York, and so I want to apologize in person, but thank you for inviting me back. It is an honor for me to share the podium with John, an incredible honoree and so deserving of your recognition. To YS, thank you for your persistence. We've had conversations over the last 4 or 5 years about me coming, so thank you so much. To Kyung and the board and the staff of KACF, you are a remarkable group of people. Congratulations for a huge success. You know, many of you may not know, but I'm coming home tonight. I was born in New York City, and so it's really terrific to come back. I was raised on 110th in Amsterdam. I went to PS 165 and PS 54, so I can still talk like this. I'm going to do a little talk story and share with you about how my path led me to the Gates Foundation. When I was here in New York City, there were such a small number of Korean Americans. We wouldn't have filled up more than a few tables. In 1950, when my parents immigrated, only 107 Koreans were admitted to the United States between 1948 and 1950. In fact, it's estimated that the entire US population of Korean Americans was 5,000 people. If you think about the number of people who are in this ballroom and all your families, that exceeds the entire Korean American population when my parents immigrated. Today, New York City is the second largest concentration of Korean Americans outside of LA and, of course, outside of Korea. You know, my story, like many of yours, started with my parents. They immigrated from Korea with two very different stories. They each immigrated in 1948, separately. My mother's family was affluent. Her father was a doctor, her grandfather was a doctor, her brothers, cousins, they were all doctors. Now, she was fortunate because her dad was pretty progressive and he insisted that she go to college. So, of course, she went to Ewha. But she also had an independent streak. So she was supposed to get married and she kept saying no. And she applied for and received one of the first postgraduate scholarships and probably one of the first women to get a postgraduate scholarship. So she came to study at Oregon State University by herself, kind of unheard of. On the other side was my father. He was orphaned at the age of 9, raised by his older brother, who became a leader in the independence movement, Choe. He died, and my father was an introvert, so didn't want to get involved in politics, but fortunately, he was a brilliant student. He was admitted to Seoul National University and excelled. He was actually invited to a visiting professorship at Princeton, and came here to New York to help start the first Korean consulate. Now, like many in our community, and like many in our immigrant community, both were drawn to the United States because of the promise of a future. You know, in Korea, you have to have a family name and connections to have a future. My father would never have that pedigree, but he thought maybe I could have a future in Korea. My mother had an independent streak that was so unique to her. And so when a friend reintroduced my parents in Korea, they got married and they moved here to New York. So I grew up in New York City. And there were no Korean Americans in PS 165 and PS 54. So I grew up with people asking me, well, Korea, is that in between Korea, Japanese and Chinese? And I had to explain, no, it's an independent country with a long history. My best friend was Barbara Blumen. She was Jewish. And one summer, she was taking Yiddish lessons. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty cool. So I wanted to take Yiddish lessons. So I went home, and it didn't go over well with my mother because I had never expressed interest in taking Korean lessons. So needless to say, I didn't take Yiddish lessons. In 1966, during the Boeing boom, Boeing came knocking and recruited my father. And so, against my wishes as a 12-year-old, we were shipped to Seattle. Now, even as a 12-year-old, I knew that Manhattan was pretty much where it was at. And when I moved to Seattle, it was a pretty small town, not very diverse, and it was a real wake-up call. It was actually the first time I had to grapple with my identity because I stood out. When I went to my 8th grade class and got acclimated to my new junior high school, there were 3 students of color. And I remember my first week of school, I came home and asked my mom, where are the rest of the students? Because certainly there are more like me, and there weren't. But it's been exciting to see Seattle grow. You know, when we were in Seattle, there were only an estimated 5,000 Koreans in Seattle. There was only one other Korean American in my high school. The Korean Association was tiny. The entire board and membership could fit in one house, and we rotated the membership depending on who was president. I didn't speak Korean, and that was a decision that my parents made, painfully so, because at that time the literature suggested that if you were bilingual, you would be held back in school. So my brother and I were kind of outliers. We began involvement in our various communities, weren't very involved in the Korean American community, such that it was. And despite my tradition on my mother's side of being doctors, it was very obvious in my first year of pre-med that that was not going to be my path. So I pursued a degree in teaching. That was my first job. Moved back to Seattle after a few years, and I became an accidental banker. And I say that because I fell into that career because I only applied for a management training job at a bank to get interview experience. I was accepted, and I thought I'd quit after a year and go to law school or get my MBA. But thanks to the Daniels in my world, I quickly became promoted and became given opportunities for climbing the corporate ladder. During this whole time, I continued to be deeply involved in community, and one of my loves has always been politics. See, when I grew up in New York, it was during John Kennedy's era, and I took his call to service seriously. And so I would volunteer for campaigns, and about 10 years into my banking career, I bumped into a good friend of mine who was now a legislative aide to a U.S. senator when he was home for Christmas. And he asked me how long I would be at the bank, and I was starting to get restless. And he said, you should run for office. I said, I'm not going to run for office. He said, no, I think there's going to be an opening on the local city council. Just get a group of people together and see what they think. And so I did, and one of my friends, now U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke, was one of those people who were involved in politics and knew what it took to run. Well, I took their advice, and I decided to take the challenge. I wasn't sure, though, and one of the reasons that I decided finally to take it was I really didn't have that much of a risk. I thought of what my father did at the age of 40, coming from Korea to this country with no friends, no family, no support structure, and the worst that I could do was lose. And it was nothing compared to the courage that my father showed. Now, one of my great mentors, Ruth Wu, she is the Grace Liu Vokhausen of Seattle, where all paths lead, convinced me that I had to run full-time. So I quit my job, ran full-time, and I was fortunate to win with a 70% margin. Now, one of the things that you do in politics, as you all know, is you ask for support from diverse communities. And I was very fortunate. I had support from the women's community, the business community, so it was only natural that I would go to my own Korean American community. And so I went to the elders and I asked for support. Now, they were very, very cool. They didn't jump up and down and say, wow, you'd be the first Korean American elected to a major office, because I didn't speak Korean, I was single, I was a woman, they didn't really know me, and politics was not considered an honorable profession. So I was kind of disappointed, but I went on my way. Well, after I left that meeting, Rocky Kim Young-soo, who kind of became my godfather, unbeknownst to me, behind closed doors, said, listen up, she's going to win. And if we don't support her, we're going to look stupid. So pony up. And that was actually the story of how the Korean American community backed me. And it wouldn't happen today, obviously, but my community had never been involved in a political campaign before. They turned out in an amazing way. They actually made yard signs. They doorbelled. They raised money. And they were there for me. I won, and I didn't really realize until after I won what this symbolized. It meant that if I could win and break a bamboo ceiling, that their daughters and their sons could go on to be elected to the Assembly or Congress or governor. And that's part of the passion that fueled their support for me. They were truly a remarkable force. After 2 terms on the city council, I decided that that was enough. I had done what I came to do. We transformed downtown Seattle and did some other amazing things. So I announced I wasn't going to run for a 3rd term. And Gary Locke, my friend, was then governor, and so called me to join his administration, which I did. I led the agency that was in charge of international trade, economic development, and community development. I promised him I would stay for 15 to 24 months, but in my 5th year, so I'm not a very good judge of time, Boeing stepped up with a competition. They opened up a competition for the 787 Dreamliner, their new generation of aircraft, to any state in the United States. And it was a huge competition. They weren't very pleased with the business climate of Washington State. And so Governor Locke appointed me to win that competition. Now, the truth is that the only reason that Boeing did not exclude us was they couldn't think of a rational reason to. But they didn't give us any chance of winning. And so thanks to the governor and the brightest people in state government and private sector help, we put together a compelling bid, outbid North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Oklahoma, and won that competition. You know, it was personal because one of the things that I didn't tell you is that after Boeing moved my family to Seattle, 3 years after that, my father was one of 50,000 engineers who was let go in the Boeing bust. And so this was a very personal competition for me because it meant that if the state lost one of its own homegrown industries, it would have devastating implications for the rest of our economy. After I won that competition, I decided I was going to take a 6 to 12 month sabbatical. And it hadn't been announced that I was leaving, but I got a call from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Sylvia Matthews Burwell was my boss eventually, and she is now the OMB director of the United States. I respectfully declined the offer because I really was set on my sabbatical, hard as it is to believe. Sylvia is a very persistent person, which serves her well in this position. And she called me back the next day, and she said, well, just come talk to us. And we want to talk to you about a position in global libraries. And I said, you know, I'm not a librarian, and I'm not a techie. And she said, I know you're going to take a sabbatical. Just come talk to us. What could it hurt? So I came to the Gates Foundation. We were about 120 people at that point. There was no such thing as global development. And she had lined up all these people to talk to me. And I said, you know, we should just cancel all these appointments because I have no intention of working. And she said, well, you're here. Come talk with us. The more I talked to people, the more I realized what an amazing opportunity this was. Bill and Melinda Gates are truly remarkable philanthropists. In my career in government, one of the biggest constraints you have is money. If I only had a few dollars, I could do great things. And part of the constraint is hiring the people that you want. Well, what the Gates Foundation does is they take all those excuses away. Thanks to the amazing generosity of Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett, we are the world's largest foundation. We have people who could do anything they want, who have run billion-dollar organizations, who have created amazing things, and they have come to work for us because they share the passion in one very simple, powerful mission, and that is to create a world where everybody has a chance to live a healthy and productive life. I realized that I would probably never have this opportunity again. And it was just too tempting. And so I accepted the position. That was 2 years before Warren Buffett gave us his amazing gift. And it's been amazing to watch the foundation grow. I was talking earlier today at the Ford Foundation with the Asian Americans in Philanthropy. And I was talking about what responsibilities and opportunities philanthropy has in this country. Philanthropy is still largely an American enterprise. We have the opportunity to be catalysts. And I want to talk a little bit, as much as it may be a surprise to you, at how much KACF and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has in common. We are both foundations. We both know how difficult it is to give away money well. We both seek to be catalysts for sustained impact. We know how important partnerships are. You know, at the Gates Foundation, we're often looked at the funder of last resort. People say, well, you've got tons of money. You should just fund this. You should replace government. In the last several years of the Great Recession, they've had cuts. Why don't you just fund this? Just want to give you a little bit of a perspective that we spend about $500 million in the United States, largely on education, in 1 year. In 1 year, California's education budget alone is $38 billion. That is the equivalent to our entire corpus. So, as fortunate as we are to have the resources that we do, it's a drop in the bucket compared to some of the challenges that we face. Whether it's eradicating polio, which is our top foundation priority, whether it is to find an HIV/AIDS vaccine or a malaria vaccine, or to ensure that every teacher in front of a classroom is effective. We understand how critical partnerships are. Now, the Gates Foundation started out actually as an operating foundation in my program where we actually delivered computers and did the training. You can't scale that model very well if you want to give away $4 billion a year. And so the way that we do our work is to find great grantees and organizations, just like KACF does. It's to find organizations that understand the problems, that have the leadership and the capability to actually execute and deliver enormously complex problems. And it often takes government, private sector, and nonprofits. Now, it's tempting for us sometimes to come in and tell people what to do. We don't have all the answers, but that doesn't sustain you for the long run. You know, one interesting observation that I've had as I've gotten to know KCF, and one of the reasons why it's so important, is because you do know the community. You sparked a vision and you've catalyzed this group for collective giving. You also understand what's important to our community. Last year, Pew published a groundbreaking study on Asian Americans and also had data that was aggregated for Korean Americans. 58% of Korean Americans said that most or all of our friends are Korean Americans. So we like to hang out with each other. It's the highest percentage of all Asian Pacific Islanders. 67% of Korean Americans noted that being a good parent is very important to them, compared to 50% of the general American population. 34% of Korean Americans see helping others as one of the most important things they should do. That compares to 28% for other Asian Americans and only 20% for the general population. It explains why you are in this room. You know, as was mentioned before, the Korean community is still largely immigrant-born. 75% of our community were born in Korea, lower than the 59% for other Asian Americans. I also want to just give you a snapshot of what this collective impact can do in a very short amount of time. By an accident of birth, I was born in New York City. I could have been born in New Delhi, Somalia, anywhere else. But because I was born in the United States, my life expectancy today is 86 years old. When my mother was born in South Korea in 1916, her life expectancy was 37 years old. Today, if you were born in Korea, your life expectancy is 82 years old. That's a function of a focus of a government on the health and the education and welfare of its people. One of the miracle stories today is how Korea began its history in the modern world as a recipient of development aid, of donor aid from all countries. Today, it's one of the only countries who has transitioned into being a net donor, who is now giving funds to development around the world, sharing their expertise in science and technology, and it's a remarkable transformation in such a short amount of time. Both KCF and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation focus on vulnerable communities. We know that it's important to catalyze and create new philanthropists, and that's exactly what you're doing. You know, we're only 2 years older than you are. We started in the year 2000. One of the things that Bill and Melinda and Warren have done in recent years is to launch something called the Giving Pledge. It is a commitment of the world's wealthiest families to dedicate the majority of their wealth to philanthropy. And today, over 100 families have taken their pledge. Now, you may think, I'm not a billionaire, I don't have the resources that Bill and Melinda do, but every one of us has something to give. KACF started with $1 a day for neighbors, and look at what you've grown in just a few short years. KACF is creating a practice and a philosophy of philanthropy. You are reinventing a kind of philanthropy as we speak. And it's amazing what you've created. You know, as I watch the video of the elderly lunch, it's an example of what that collective impact can do. You are an amazingly inspirational national model. I understand that there's a table from San Francisco here who's coming here to observe, to learn how to do it. Your circles of support have expanded giving well beyond the community of Korean Americans. I understand that about half of you are outside the Korean American community. You know, we are the Korean American diaspora. We live all over the world. We may not speak the language, but we share the passion. We have, among our most important priorities, taking care of our family and our communities. Whether you came here thinking of yourself as a philanthropist or not, you are. And your presence here demonstrates that. If you haven't already become a donor to KACF, there are many ways you can do that or volunteer. Learn grant making, serve on a grant making committee. There's lots and lots of opportunities. You know, the incredible hard work and commitment to giving the next generation a better life than the one we realized is something that I saw from my parents and that many of you have done for your children. And that sense of community explains why KACF is such a remarkable story. Thank you so much for what you've done. I just want to close with a quote from Margaret Mead, which I think epitomizes KACF. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Continue to change the world, KACF. Thank you so much.